There is this way of dealing with systems, and it's called system schema. And so, what I want to show you before you do a group lab on it, a thought experiment lab, studio lab, whatever we call it, is system schema. So, what I have here, uh, a blue block and a green block on a white surface. All right, that's just literally a block diagram, quite quite literally. And what we want to do is, before we start writing force diagrams, which is something we need to do in order to solve force problems, we need to consider the system. So the system schema is something we'll do a number of times to direct our thinking. And it actually is a check and balances, if you will, to see if your equation has the right number of terms. But it's also the right way to think about your equations. And so you'll see that shortly. So what we do when we draw a system schema, it's an abstraction of something. Okay, so we could literally put two books or two blocks on top of each other on top of a table. Could literally have that. This would be an abstraction of that, pretty close to reality. And now we're going to go another layer into it and try to understand it. So what we do when we draw a system schema is we first just give some labels to things. So we could call this A, and we could call that B. This block A, block B, whatever we want to do. And we could call this uh, the floor. All right. I would have used B for both, but they were, book, block, they're all B words, so we'll just use letters uh, to symbolize those. And so now I have three things that are explicitly in the system. And so I can uh, label those. I could have A, B, and F. Now, the floor, what is the floor on, generally speaking? The ground, and the ground is part of what? The earth. So when we're dealing with forces, at least forces on earth, inevitably gravity, this thing called the earth, which exerts a gravitational force on everything near it, whether it's on it or near it, uh, is part of the system implicitly. All right, so we don't neglect the earth. So earth is kind of big, so I'll just draw it there. And so we could include the earth in our system. So the bubbles with letters are abstractions of the system, and a system consists of one or more objects. Okay, and so usually the system is a single thing in the problem that we're addressing, like the car, the person, the mass on a spring. But sometimes systems consist of numerous things, like the system of planets, that sort of stuff. We're going to mostly do the former single object systems that tend to interact with other systems, surfaces, gravitational bodies, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have this system schema. And we notice some things. A and B, blocks A and B, they're in contact with one another. They're in contact with the floor. And in this system, they're in contact with the earth. So everything is in contact in series. All right, so we want to encode for that. So what we can do is we can just have a contact forces. Because they're actually touching one another. So anytime objects within the system or systems are in physical contact, then that means there's going to be a contact force. I want you to get in your mind as best you can right now. There's force is force. It's simply a way to describe an interaction. And there are contact forces and there are field forces. Electric field, gravitational field, magnetic field. All right? And then there's frictional forces, okay, which is ultimately field forces interacting with one another, electric fields, because that's structure of matter, but that's a longer story for some other time. So we have the contact forces. Now, what does gravity affect in the system or the Earth? What is the Earth? So let's pretend that this second floor was on the ground, or we could go down to the first floor, and the first floor is on the ground. But there's a floor on top of the ground. Does the Earth have an influence on that floor besides the contact force? Yeah, it's massive bodies have a force of attraction that we like to call gravity. All right, and whether or not it actually works the way we think it does from a Newtonian perspective is another story. But it is in contact, and the law of gravity, Newton's law of gravity, does an excellent job uh, modeling gravitational force interactions for things that are large, meaning bigger than, say, an electron, and slow, such as less than 97% of the speed of light. That's most things. Okay. Technically, Einstein's formulation through relativity is closer to the truth, and his theory covers a lot more ground than Newton's. But Newton's theory was fantastic for its day, and mainly there was no such thing as field theory when he invented it, so he couldn't have possibly known. But in spite of not having it technically right, at least as technically right as Einstein is, still a fantastic approximation because it works like all the time. And then if it doesn't work, you just put the fudge factor in, and then it's just the same as Einstein. But anyways, get to that later. So there is another interaction. There's a gravitational interaction between everything in the system and the Earth. Block A, Block B, and the floor all have a gravitational interaction with the Earth. And so we need to encode for that. So we will. So I'll switch up colors here. And so there is I'll use a different color than that. There's a gravitational interaction there, gravitational interaction there, and a gravitational interaction there. And I draw the arrows two ways in both the contact and the gravitational force because any massive body, doesn't matter how small or large the mass is, exerts a gravitational tug on any other massive body in the vicinity. So the force of gravity that you exert on the Earth is actually the same as what the Earth exerts on you, so to speak. Okay? They're equal and opposite. We'll find more about that later. The contact forces. A is in contact with B and B is in contact with A. It's a two-way contact force. So forces always come in pairs. So this system schema also subtly is modeling the way that we understand forces act. So we've now drawn a system schema here. And what we would do now is if we wanted to pay attention to the forces, if we wanted to sum the forces, say, on one block, okay? So let's say we wanted to get a highlighter out here. Let's say we wanted to pay attention to this this system here, the top block. That's supposed to be a dashed line. You're going to get a nice pretty handout on this, so don't worry. let's say I wanted to pay attention to just that block. What is going on here is I would notice that right here, I could put this around that way, there are two force interactions that cross that system boundary. So when we pick a system, okay, and say we want to know about the forces on this block, okay, we would, on our system schema, identify that thing as the system. So if I say system A, okay, the top block, now I've identified it. It has two forces on that system. So our system schema work is done, all right? And now we're going to switch into force diagram of the system. And the way every textbook in the universe brings in force diagrams, they just bring them in by way of example only, instead of giving you a more general tool that defines the system in advance of drawing the diagram of the system. A system schema is not a, well, it is a diagram of the system, but it's not a diagram of the system that I can get any math out of. The force diagram is so you can do the math. All right, as we're going to get plenty of practice in that in the next 2 weeks, this week and next, and well, the whole course. All right. So we've done our system, we've conceptualized it with the system schema, which you can have a schema for anything, or a scheme. All right, it's a general idea that you had in your life. So now the force diagram. So when we draw a force diagram, we use the point particle model. Okay, so we have a point particle. All right, we're going to do this a whole bunch. All right, we'll have individual points that we'll play with a lot, and then eventually we'll have a collection of points, such as an extended body. But now we have a further abstraction of block A, just this particular part of the system, as a point particle. So we go from decontextualizing the blocks as just general bubbles in a system schema. So we just kick to the curb all of the details about the block, because they don't matter for our force interaction. We just need things are in certain kinds of force interactions. All right. So if we draw, excuse me, a force diagram, it's a vector thing. So you would draw arrows that indicate the direction and magnitude of said forces, up, down, left, right, off at angles. If this force is bigger than that force, it's a longer arrow. Okay. And then from this, we can do various kinds of summing and trigonometry and stuff like that. So this first system here, block A, it weighs something. If I were to put a kitchen scale or a bathroom scale underneath block A, between it and block B, I could read what its weight is, just like I could if it were on the ground. So it has a weight force directed down. Right? So we know that there's a force. Okay, that's directed straight down. Now we're going to use, for the next week or two, in our in-class activities, and you'll have to do this probably at least once on the test when we take it, we're going to use interaction labels for the forces. And so interaction labels have two things. They have a subscript that indicates that the force of this thing on another thing. And it also has a superscript indicating what kind of force, which for now is going to be contact and gravitational. All right. So the way that this force gets labeled, it's a gravitational force. So I'm going to use this, it's not an exponent, and it's going to be a gravitational force of the Earth on block A. Now, one of the things I want to impose upon you is that when you draw a force diagram, what the arrow points to always has to be the point particle in your force diagram, because it's about the forces on that thing. So your thinking needs to be that way, and the labeling, if you follow that rule, will help you keep your thinking on track. Well, that accounts for the downward force of gravity on block A that gives it what we call weight. All right. But there's a force, a contact force on block A from block B, and that contact force is directed up. How do we know that block B is pushing up on block A? Well, stack any two things you want. Do they fall through each other? No, they sit there, right? But if you were to stack a brick on top of a piece of paper that was suspended between two, it was taped to two ledges, wouldn't it break through that paper probably? Yeah, it certainly would depress it. And that's because that paper's not pushing back as much as the brick is pushing down. So when things aren't moving, their forces are in equilibrium. And so that means there's an equal and opposite force. So I'll attempt to draw it the same length. We'll just pretend that it is. And this force is a contact force of block B on block A. So I just want to kind of restate that. What you see in green with the point particle A is a force diagram of the system. It is a diagram of what's happening in the block diagram up at the top, and it's also a force diagram of the system schema that we've identified for A. Now, notice that there are two force arrows on A in the force diagram, and there are two force interactions on block A from my system schema. So the point here about these system schemas is they help the student keep track of what's going on in the problem. And you might have noticed in physics, it's easy to lose track of what's going on in the problem. All right, there's a lot of details to decode and to account for and do math on, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a tool that sharpens your thinking, and in fact has been shown in multiple research papers to be something that helps the student do better. All right. In fact, I've uploaded one of those papers, and I will provide you with a page from that paper that has basically this written out for you. It also, so you have a template. In fact, you'll have another thing that I'm not going to draw on screen, another system and a way to think about that. So you'll have a template to go off of, which you're going to need today. And so now we have our force diagram, and I'm going to now do one more system within this one. Let's switch up colors here. Oops. What if we were to do the other block B? Well, if you notice right here, there's one contact force there and another contact force there. So I know in advance I need to obtain two forces. There's a gravitation, so it's really going to be the same, and the difference here is that this block is on the floor instead of on another block. Still got gravity pulling on it. All right. So what we have here is we have oh, I have to be careful there. I forgot one, didn't I? And there's one up here. There's three. One right there, one right here, and one right here. There are three forces on that thing. So one of the forces on this block is the gravitational force. It's the force of the Earth on the block, okay, on B. So if we gravitational force of Earth on the block, or on B rather, all right? That's one of those forces, this one right here. Then there's a contact force. Aren't there two contact forces? There's one from the floor to block B, and there's one that's pushing up. So the floor is pushing up on block B, and then block A is pushing down on it. Those forces need to be in equilibrium, okay, because the thing isn't moving. But here's the thing is, it's not that those individual forces need to be in equilibrium. It says all of the down forces have to add up in magnitude to be equal to all of the up forces, because the particle's not moving. Its acceleration is zero in terms of its motion. Okay, so that's that one. So I'm going to, I'm going to do this, make this extra large for a reason. So if I think that the force of contact of the floor on block B is that big, then let me change that up a little bit, make it a little bit longer. Then something's missing in the rest of my diagram. That means that there's another, and I know I have a third force, okay? So that means that the force of block A on block B would need to be a little bit smaller, maybe like that. Okay, and let's just pretend that that yellow down arrow and the blue down arrow, when I add them up, are the same length as the upward blue arrow. Now, if I were to put scales, kitchen scales, bathroom scales, all right, and measure the weight, if I put one between block A and B and one between block B and the floor, which one was going to read more weight? Between the floor and the bottom block. Because why? There's another block on top of it. And so that's why that blue up arrow for the floor on the block, that's a scale reading. That's like there's a bathroom scale between the floor and the block. That would read more in magnitude than the other one. Because block A, if I put one on that, it's just block A, not block A and block B. All right, so the system schemas also force us, if we obey the rules of vector addition, to account for relative magnitudes. Okay, it's mostly about counting up the forces. We use the system schema. All right, I need three forces in my diagram. So then you go make a force diagram, and if you get three forces, there's a good chance that if you pulled them from the schema, that you have the right three forces. What could go wrong is that they're in the wrong direction, maybe they're the wrong size, et cetera, et cetera. But what you know is that the sum of the up ones has to equal the sum of the down ones, since nothing's moving. It's an equilibrium. Now you can have it moving in equilibrium as long as the acceleration is zero. So you, like something in space, could have no forces acting on it, and it's just moving. All right, because something got it moving before you decided to pay attention to it. So that's a force diagram. So we've gone from, let me, this stuff is the system schema stuff, and this stuff is the force diagram stuff. System schemas and force diagrams.